Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Glasgow. I'm Professor Frank Coton. I'm the Senior Vice Principal at the University, and it's my honour and privilege to be here this evening to introduce our 24th Annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture. The University of Glasgow Holocaust Memorial Lecture was established by Professor Bernard Wasserstein and Emeritus Professor Otto Hutter, with the first lecture taking place back in 2001. And since that inaugural lecture, this event has become a really important fixture within the University of Glasgow's calendar and a major annual contribution to the global academic conversation, attracting some of the most respected experts in Holocaust studies from around the world. And tonight, of course, is no exception. I'm grateful to you all for joining us here this evening, and I know that some people are also joining online and continuing to make this lecture series a success. But the success of the series is not ours alone, and we're deeply grateful to our friends. Oops, I'm walking too close to a microphone there. I'll walk over here. We're deeply grateful to our friends, colleagues, and partners who've continued to support this annual lecture, many of whom have been with us on the journey since the beginning. And with that in mind, I'd like to welcome our long-standing friends from the Association of Jewish Refugees, who are here with us in the audience, and may I also take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Henry Lovett and Mia Spiro, for their help in producing the lecture this evening. And for those joining us remotely, again, you're an important part of this audience this evening, so thank you for being a part of this event. This is an occasion of profound significance where we come together to commemorate the lives lost and the resilience shown during one of the darkest periods in human history. The relevance of this event to the present day is crystal clear. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of hatred and the importance of standing against prejudice in all its forms. The echoes of history that emanate from the Holocaust should always prompt us to prioritize learning and understanding of what happened to ensure that we continually steer humanity away from the darkness and into the light. Tonight, we're honoured and deeply privileged to have Dr. Waitman Beorn joining us as our distinguished guest speaker. Dr. Beorn is an assistant professor in history at Northumbria University. With a rich academic background, Dr. Beorn previously directed the Virginia Holocaust Museum and held the inaugural Blumpkin Professorship of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Dr. Beorn's scholarly contributions are exceptional. Notably, his acclaimed book, Marching into Darkness, the Wehrmacht and the Holocaust in Belarus, which received many prestigious accolades. He's an integral part of the groundbreaking group Holocaust Geographies, exploring spatial dynamics in the Holocaust, and has contributed significantly to publications and to media outlets. Bringing this expertise into the classroom, Dr. Beorn teaches a wide variety of courses, including Holocaust history, comparative genocide, and digital history. His dedication extends to projects reconstructing historical sites digitally, like the Janowska camp. And tonight, his insights promise to deepen our understanding of this pivotal historical period. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome such an esteemed speaker to the stage tonight. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Beorn to share his profound knowledge with us.
Thank you. Everybody hear me? Okay, great. I got to put my glasses on because I'm reaching that age. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out I'd like to thank the University of Glasgow, Professor Coton, and Dr. Spiro for inviting me to deliver this lecture tonight. In my view, one of the most important things that we can do as historians is to talk to the public. I don't want to be the person who has a really important book that 7 grad students have read in the library. And when I was asked to speak, I had a look at some of the previous speakers, and I must say that I'm truly standing on the shoulders of giants tonight. It was more than a little intimidating, one might say. But I hope I'll leave you tonight with perhaps some new ways of looking at the Holocaust and a whole new set of questions to ask about it. So let's go ahead and get started. Leon Wells stood in his own grave twice, literally. He first entered the Janowska camp in 1942 as a 16-year-old boy who had volunteered to take his father's place in a work detail because his father was ill. In the camp, Leon had pretended to be a glass worker to escape almost certain death as a common laborer. Yet, he soon caught typhus. The disease had wrecked his body, and he had given up on life. The SS accordingly marked him for death. At the moment of his execution, however, the guards ordered him to return to the camp to bring an additional corpse to the gravesite. In this interlude, Leon decided that he wanted to live, and he eluded his captor, pretending to be hiding amongst other prisoners who were lining up for lunch. And in his testimony, it's amazing because basically he says that the guard was screaming his name at one end. Whenever he would hear the name, he would just go to the farthest point away from him. The next day, he escaped the camp, pretending to be leaving to do glasswork in an SS residence. He then fled to the countryside in search of his family. A little over a year later, Wells was imprisoned again in the camp. This time, he was assigned to the Death Brigade, a group of prisoners forced to excavate and destroy the bodies of Nazi victims. His job was to count the skulls to ensure that each grave was fully emptied. On one occasion, the SS men in charge became increasingly frustrated as they were one skull short. This skull was, of course, Leon's, and he was still using it. The guard he'd escaped from had not reported his earlier escape in order to avoid punishment for his failure as a guard, and so Leon had been marked as dead and buried, hence the overcounting of actual skulls by one. Leon's experience in the camp as a narrative is compelling, but it is also deeply spatial. Like many survivors, his story is grounded in where he was and where he was in relation to others. Wells had found himself in an ever-constricting geography, from occupied Poland to the Lviv ghetto to the Janowska camp. His location was critical to both his survival and, but for his luck, his death. The warm environment and relatively non-strenuous work in the glass workshop had likely saved his life to begin with. The proximity of the killing site in the ravines just behind the camp meant that it was more convenient for the SS to send him back for one more body. The demand for slave labor by SS men living above their means on the periphery of the Nazi Empire allowed him to leave the camp under certain circumstances. And yet, when he returned to his grave a year later, the context was entirely different. And here might be a good place to articulate the difference between space and place. Anthropologists, geographers, and dare I say historians use these terms to unpick the landscapes of history. These concepts were central to the work of Yi-Fu Tuan, arguably one of the founders of modern human geography. A space is quite simply a location. It can be represented by a grid coordinate. Here I am, that's me, right there. The spot where I'm standing tonight has always existed, from the beginning of time. However, this same place has been in a state of almost constant change. That is because place is the set of meanings, associations, obligations, and history combined with a location. If I were to go back a century or so, I might find that I'm standing in the Hillhead Congregational Church, which would make this a much different sort of presentation, I suspect. Going back a bit farther than that, I might be standing in a small field in a village dominated by a power loom factory. It is the combination of many historical contexts that make a place a place. But don't be fooled into thinking this is some exercise in academic navel-gazing. The meaning of place changes what we do and how we think. It affects what behaviors are permissible and what forms of expression are appropriate. In this way, geography at any scale is not a neutral canvas. While it doesn't always dictate the course of historical events, it does often put its finger on the scales in one way or another, depending on context. And so what I would like for us to just consider this evening is how does thinking about the Holocaust through the lens of place change our understanding of this event? For while the Holocaust as historical phenomenon may be abstract, it occurred in specific places, places that everyone involved mined for critical meanings. I'm going to use the example of the Janowska camp as a vehicle to explore this question from a variety of perspectives. I'm first going to begin by looking at the microspaces of the camp itself and the various meanings they held for both perpetrators and victims. Though I actually hate those categories, but we sort of work with that in the discipline. And then I'm going to move to a larger scale and look at the camp and its inhabitants as part of a broader network of people, things, and ideas. It is this web of often hidden connections that I think is in some ways the most compelling and challenging way to think about the Holocaust in a spatial context. But first I should begin with a brief history of the camp itself, and this is painfully brief. This is a project that I've spent almost 13 years working on, so it could be hours and hours, but I'm not going to do that. Janowska, I would argue, is the most important Holocaust site you've probably never heard of. And I might further argue that one of the reasons you haven't heard about it is its very location. The camp itself was located at the periphery of the Nazi Empire in the east, and later behind the Iron Curtain, which meant that its story remained for a long time at the very edges of scholarship on the Holocaust. The Janowska camp was located in what is today the city of Lviv, but depending on time and speaker, was also known as Lemberg, Lvov, and Lvov. By itself, Lviv is a great exemplar of the concepts of place and space, going from Poland to the Habsburg Empire, to Poland, to the Soviet Union, to Ukraine. While its location never changed, Lviv meant many different things to many different people. One of its important meanings was as the capital city of the historic region of Galicia, which was home to a Jewish population of over 800,000 and occupies parts of several modern countries today. Part of Poland, though, before World War II, Lviv fell into the Soviet zone of occupation from 1939 to 1941. When the Nazis, in turn, invaded the Soviet Union, the city became part of District Galician, which itself was part of Hans Frank's general government carved out of Poland. It was here that two SS officers traveled in August 1941 to set up a Nazi concentration camp as part of the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, or the German Equipment Works, or DAW for short. The DAW as a whole was one of the largest and most important economic enterprises controlled by the SS, and it relied on slave labor. And so Wolfgang Mohlwinkel and Fritz Gebauer arrived at an abandoned industrial site 20 minutes from the city center by foot. And there's two slides here that I'll just highlight. This is a German map from 1941 of Lviv, and you can see the city center. It's not showing up here, but it's labeled here. And then the ghetto is this area north of the train tracks, and the camp is literally about a 20-minute walk from downtown, which makes it, I think, also quite interesting compared to lots of other camps that are sort of in more out-of-the-way areas. This is very much an urban camp. And you'll be seeing this image a lot as well, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. This is a Luftwaffe aerial photograph taken in June 1944 that actually shows the camp and all the buildings associated with it in operation. I'll talk a little bit about that now. Wolfgang Mohlwinkel, who was one of the SS men, had previously run one of these DAW camps in Lublin. and Gebauer had been picked to be the commandant of the Lviv DAW camp. Gebauer was born in the German border region of Silesia in 1906, and after a short stint in the Luftwaffe, he had been mainly employed by the Siemens and the Arado aircraft factories as an electrician, which exempted him from further war service. Using Jewish slave labor from the Lviv ghetto, which held 160,000 Jews, and just to give you a bit of context, that's more than the entire Jewish population of the Netherlands, right? So we talk about the scale of the Holocaust in the East. This is a good example. Gebauer began improving the site and preparing it to manufacture all manner of products for the Nazi state and to house Jews. The site was conveniently located next to the Klepperhof freight rail station, some 200 meters away. Some of the first prisoners were also transferred from Mowinckel's camp in Lublin. And so on Halloween night, 1941, Gebauer informed his workers that they would no longer be returning to the ghetto each night, but were now prisoners and would remain in the camp. With that, the DAW Lemberg was up and running. And here might be a good time to explain that what many survivors and historians refer to as the Janowska camp was actually two camps side by side. The DAW, which I've already mentioned, and the Zwangsarbeitslager Lemberg, or Forced Labor Camp Lviv, or ZAL for short, which was founded a few months after Gebauer's camp. Indeed, it must have been particularly embarrassing for Gebauer that his own deputy, Gustav Wilhaus, had politicked with the SS and police leader in District Galizien for his own camp next door. Wilhaus was a semi-literate mechanic from another border region, this time the Saar, on Germany's western border. He was a rabid Nazi and a deeply unscrupulous and ambitious man who had served in the Norway campaign with the Waffen-SS. In March 1942, he set about building his camp with material looted from across the region, and also looted from the DAW, which again did not ingratiate himself with Gebauer. Wilhaus lived in a villa in the camp with his wife, also a committed Nazi, and their 4-year-old daughter, Heike. For fun, Wilhaus and his wife liked to shoot prisoners from their balcony. As one survivor recalled, quote, "The devil himself must have been the matchmaker of this couple," end quote. In November 1943, however, the prisoners rose up in two separate places, killing several guards and enabling some to escape. Almost all remaining prisoners were then killed. The camp limped on, however, until July 1944, when it was evacuated and the last prisoners transferred to camps in the West. In the end, as many as 80,000 people, mainly Jews, were murdered in and around the Janowska camp. In addition, the camp staff played a critical role in the further murder of over 400,000 Galician Jews. Beyond this obvious significance, the camp is of particular interest because it was a true hybrid camp that fulfilled three roles simultaneously. Throughout its existence, it was a slave labor camp, a transit camp, and a killing site. The first purpose of the camp was to provide slave labor for a dizzying variety of concerns throughout the area. In addition to staffing various work brigades within Janowska itself, the camp provided workers for the Luftwaffe at the nearby airport, for the Wehrmacht at an army motor pool, for the German railroad, for a local brewery, for a uniform factory, for the Lviv city park system, and it provided prisoners as personal servants for the SS, to name a few employers. Thousands died at work. One of the most feared tasks was the so-called vitamin work, from the Polish words for beams, bricks, and planks, BCD, vitamins. After a long day at work, camp inmates were forced to unload building supplies at the train station and carry them to the camp at a run. The second function of the camp was as a transit camp. Its proximity to the train station made it an ideal place to form the transports from Lviv to the gas chambers at the nearby Belzec extermination camp, where approximately 435,000 Jews were murdered. Almost all of them came from District Galizien. Jews from the Lviv ghetto were first taken to the camp on foot, by truck, or on the city streetcar line, which had to stop just outside the gates. And this is an image of Jews on that streetcar line being taken to the camp. Because Lviv was a main stop on the rail line to Belzec, camp commandants had access to trains from throughout the region on their way to the killing center. Wilhaus and his successor, a guy named Friedrich Wartzak, would routinely add Janowska prisoners to the death trains passing through. The camp also served as a hub for supplying other major building projects with labor, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute or two. Lastly, the camp itself and the ravines just behind it functioned as a dedicated killing site for the Jews of Lviv and of the region. Here again, the geography was not neutral. The ravines and sandy soil made the hills northeast of the camp ideal as grave sites. Large mass shootings accompanied the daily executions. For example, in February 1942, a transport of 195 men, women, and children arrived from the town of Ivano-Frankivsk, 70 miles to the southeast. These, however, were not sent to Belzec, which hadn't opened yet, but taken to the sands behind the camp and shot instead. Leon Wells described his own almost execution at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961. He said, quote, "When we got to the sand, we found there was no grave prepared for us. We got undressed, again were registered by name so as to know for sure that no one disappeared on the marching road. Everybody got a shovel, and we started to dig our own grave. When the grave was finished, they started to read from these registration lists, and the victims by two walked down to the grave, had to lay down side by side with their faces down, and were shot. The next two had to cover a little sand over the first two and lie down in the other direction, line by line, and were shot again. And so it went ahead." End quote. In December 1942, the Belzec extermination camp murdered its last trainload of Jews and closed. This made the Janowska camp the largest single killing site in District Galician. When the Lviv ghetto was finally liquidated, its 12,000 remaining Jews were shot in the camp. In addition to killings on site, the camp personnel were not infrequently called upon to travel to surrounding towns and villages to murder Jews. To put the scale of killing at Janowska in context, even the most conservative death toll estimates mean that more Jews died at Janowska than at Dachau, Buchenwald, or Bergen-Belsen. And in fact, more than most of the non-extermination centers that you probably heard of, to include Majdanek, which is often sometimes listed among the extermination centers. With that admittedly all too brief introduction to the camp, let's look at it from a spatial perspective, starting with the lowest level and broadening out from there. While this may seem an academic approach, realize that prisoners themselves knew all too well that an understanding of the place, that is, the meaning of locations, could mean the difference between life and death. Take, for example, the commandant's villa. All the inmates knew that its occupants enjoyed shooting prisoners from the balcony. So as one survivor recalled, quote, "The prisoners avoided as much as possible the pretty white villa with the wonderful garden," end quote. This also meant moving around the camp using routes that masked them from the sniper's view. Leon Wells chose a different tactic. He recalled that, quote, "I used to be able to walk by every day any place I wanted because I took a piece of glass in front of me. They wouldn't break glass," end quote. The villa, therefore, while occupying the same space, was for prisoners a place of death, and for the SS a place of fun and enjoyment. Another area of the camp that represents this multiverse of meaning was the camp latrines. The latrines were not surprisingly completely inadequate for the camp population. Covered with excrement, they were simply foul in every aspect. As a result, the SS guards rarely got near them, let alone entered them. This made them, ironically, a place of safety for prisoners. As one survivor recalled, quote, "Most black market transactions took place in a latrine, where the guarding was less strict and congestion helped conceal what was going on," end quote. Another noted that it was in this unbelievably disgusting atmosphere, in the middle of stinking filth, in view of bodies performing their functions, that most meetings between friends took place, along with the business dealings of the camp, end quote. However, at night, the latrines became something altogether different. Prisoners were forbidden from leaving the barracks at night, being limited to a bucket for their needs. As a result, many had to sneak out of the barracks to use the latrine. For the SS, this became a game. A survivor explained that, quote, the SS men would hide behind barracks and unexpectedly attack the victim, beating him with a whip on the head until he fell on the ground in a pool of blood. If the victim did not die, he would be taken the very next morning out of his row at the selection as a cripple and sent behind wire to be executed, end quote. Thus, the latrines were literally purveyors of life or death for prisoners, depending on the time of day. Various spaces of the camp similarly became known for often very specific kinds of violence. The camp laundry is one example. It was one of the few places in Janowska where women worked. They were supervised by 21-year-old Peter Blum, an ethnic German from what is now Hungary. Blum was also a notorious rapist who preyed upon the female prisoners. This was an open secret in the camp. For the women who had to work in the laundry for over 12 hours each day, this place held additional dangers that did not apply to men. Blum took advantage of the role of the camp as a transit hub to populate his laundry with women he found attractive, that he could literally choose from the trains as they came through. And according to one prisoner, he had a special room in a clothing warehouse where he victimized women. In this instance, we can see how he modified the physical space where he worked to suit his violent tastes. A more powerful and telling example of how perpetrator attitudes merged with the physical landscape is the camp's main entrance. The main gate of the ZAL was moved in the summer of 1942 out to the main street connecting the camp to the city center. It replaced a basic barbed wire gate with a much more grandiose design, consisting of two massive pillars and an attached guard room. The two square pillars were topped with concrete German eagles, and the road was barred by two massive iron gates. From the outside, the gate conveyed a sense of ominous power, which was certainly what the Commandant Wilhaus wanted to convey. It was his kingdom, and he was the king. And in this image, you can see the man on horseback there is the Commandant Wilhaus. And just behind him to his right is a German shepherd that ran around with him. So he clearly sees himself as this kind of a despot. But on the inward-facing side was another twist. The two pillars were hollow, and inside each was a small standing cell of about 4 feet squared. These bunkers, as the prisoners referred to them, had iron gates locking the prisoners inside. Every day when work brigades left the camp for labor, they had to pass through this gate. And through the open bars, one could easily see the unfortunates crowded within, many of whom consisted of Jews caught hiding in the ghetto or hiding in the city itself. Few prisoners lasted more than 24 hours in these cells before they were led away to be shot behind the camp. I relate this example because in it we can see how the SS intentionally designed and built a structure for the express purpose of intimidating and humiliating prisoners. For them, form and function worked perfectly together. The bunkers provided a convenient place to keep individual Jews as they were delivered from the city until they were executed. But the gate structure also provided an opportunity to instruct camp prisoners about the consequences of disobeying the Nazi order of things. The bunkers were a constant reminder of the complete control of the camp SS over life and death. Positioned to gain the maximum visibility for prisoners inside the camp, while concealing the same torture from passersby. In this way, the architecture of the camp itself became a tool of oppression. I want to move on, though, to think about Janowska and its position within the Nazi Empire. Much has been written historically about the interactions between periphery and center with regards to empire. But I want to suggest that at least one way that Janowska's position on the Nazi frontier may have directly impacted its prisoners. And that is in the extreme violence they endured. The Camp SS routinely killed and tortured Janowska's inmates in such a truly depraved manner that it stands out, even to someone like me who researches such things every day. Gebauer, commandant of the DAW, specialized in personally strangling prisoners, often with his bare hands. Another SS man tortured prisoners by using them for target practice. Yet another forced people to have sex before hanging them. Prisoners were routinely left to hang on posts in the camp for days until they died. And you can see that here in one of these images, which is drawn by a prisoner, Zev Porath, an amazing individual who was an architect before the war and imprisoned in the camp as an architect. He drew these sketches as he was a prisoner, and then he escaped and took them with him, which is why we have them today. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting some kind of competitive suffering or top trumps of Nazi violence. Every camp witnessed scenes of extreme abuse and torture. What I've observed is more of a qualitative impression that Janowska seemed to feature a great deal of intimate physical violence. I want to suggest that this might have had something to do with its position at the fringes of the Third Reich, 500 miles from Berlin. Despite its importance in the Holocaust, the Janowska camp remained very much out of sight, both figuratively and literally. It was not officially part of the SS camp system until months before its liberation, when it became a sub-camp of the Majdanek camp in Lublin. Hence, the level of bureaucratic oversight the camp received was minimal. The Commandant Wilhaus, a lieutenant, reported directly to an SS general, Fritz Katzmann, the SS and police leader for District Galizien. This is not a normal relationship. Wilhaus was also of a comparatively low rank for his post. The commandants of Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Mauthausen, for example, ranged in rank from major to colonel. I'm not suggesting that those camps fit the humane image that the Nazis like to push, but on the other hand, it does seem that elsewhere, the kind of inventive, public, and visceral abuse was lessened by stricter command and control and the desire for a particularly SS form of decorum. None of this was present in Janowska. And so with brutal killers as commandants, the door was left open for escalating atrocity. The commander of the small Zhebny concentration camp, which is also a small camp in District Galizien, summed up what it must have felt like for Wilhaus as commandant of Janowska. The Zhebny commander wrote his wife before taking command that, quote, he would be his own boss and God on earth. That would be my favorite thing of all, far off the beaten track, end quote. So I want to move on now to my last point, and that is thinking about Janowska as part of a larger network of people, things, and ideas. Space, location, is simultaneously fixed and also relative. This relativity affects the meaning of a place. This can be in the sense of proximity. A place is closer to or farther from something else. It can also be in the sense of connectivity. A place is connected to another place or not. The same is true of people, things, and ideas. Every point of contact within a network generates an interaction. We may not always know the nature of the interaction, but I'd like to suggest here that we try harder to uncover these points of intersection. The history of the Holocaust ultimately is one of constant movement just as much as it is one of confinement. I'll start with things first. Alongside mass murder, mass robbery characterized the Holocaust, as well as the larger Nazi genocidal project. At the societal level, the wealth and belongings of conquered peoples, as well as Jews, were meant to flow to the Nazi state. This was state policy. These belongings, described in Polish as post-Jewish things, moved throughout the Nazi system, even after their owners had been murdered. Even an outpost of the Reich, like Janowska, played a role. For example, after it sent trains loaded with human beings to the gas chambers at Belzec, the camp received, in return, trainloads of their clothing. This clothing was meant to be washed and repaired in Peter Blum's laundry and tailor shop, and then forwarded on for use elsewhere in the Nazi state. Quite often, the best clothing was taken by the SS guards themselves. After all, who was there to stop them? And these items came from a variety of places. One SS guard testified after the war that he and Blum had traveled together to a local village after a mass execution and brought the clothing of the murdered back to the camp. The camp itself could not even keep up with the supply of looted belongings arriving. When the Soviets inspected it after liberation in September of 1944, they discovered 11,000 pairs of men's, women's, and children's shoes in the basement of one of the camp's buildings. The movement of this material through the camp had several impacts. From an SS perspective, It enabled the staff to enrich themselves to such an extent that it seems to have been an open secret among the prisoners. A survivor recalled that Wilhaus's wife was, quote, in love with her toilette and used to summon Jewish dressmakers to fulfill her orders, end quote. Bloom instructed his prisoners to carefully inspect clothing for valuables sewn into the linings, and he then pocketed the spoils. The last commandant of the camp, Friedrich Wartzak, used the wealth he had stolen to flee to Egypt, where he disappeared forever. From a prisoner perspective, items such as weapons bought from Italian soldiers would later aid in their uprising, along with the daily smuggling and the black market of supplies of food and clothing. People also moved through this system, beginning with the prisoners themselves. While the majority, at least in the beginning, were Jews from Lviv, over time the liquidation of surrounding populations and the trains bringing them to Belzec brought Jews from all over the region to the camp. Janowska served in many ways as a clearinghouse for slave labor. For example, when German railway policeman Josef Jeklein arrived at the Klepperhof station with 51 train cars of Jews from the town of Kolomia, he left 9 carloads of laborers in Janowska and loaded around 1,000 Janowska prisoners for the gas chambers at Belzec. One of the most important labor operations, and one that links periphery to center both figuratively and literally, was the so-called Durchgangsstrasse 4, or Transit Highway 4. This massive road-building project was meant to link Lviv and Rostov-on-Don, a distance of over 700 miles. It was also to serve as the main military supply line for the southern sector of the Soviet front. And this is another way in which Janowska is connected to both the war and the larger Holocaust. This is also one of Heinrich Himmler's, the head of the SS's, pet projects, to the extent that he visits Janowska to inspect how it's going. Reflecting on conditions on the road, Katzmann, the SS and police leader for District Galician, said, quote, "It is of no concern if on each kilometer 1,000 or 10,000 Jews die," end quote. And so many prisoners from Janowska, as well as those arriving there from other places, found themselves transferred to camps along the highway. And this is one of the least researched topics because these camps were mobile and would actually move along the highway as it was built. In at least one instance, however, the movement of prisoners into the camp was a positive. After December 1942, as mentioned, the Belzec Extermination Center was closed. While a few trains did take Lviv Jews to Sobibor camp instead, most killing was then localized at Janowska. Only a small number of Jews were kept alive in the ghetto for labor reasons. When the Nazis decided to liquidate this remainder, in June 1943, the Jews resisted, fighting the Germans as best they could. Katzmann himself noted the ferocity of their resistance. He wrote in his self-aggrandizing closing report that, quote, "As the number of Jews remaining grew smaller, so the resistance became even greater," end quote. While the numbers of Jews killed was immense, some were captured alive. These survivors were then transferred to Janowska, adding a group of hardened and experienced fighters to the existing camp underground. Likewise, those caught hiding in Lviv were also added to the camp population, assuming they were not imprisoned in the gate bunker and killed. I want to move on now to talk about social networks. Almost 150 years ago, a German sociologist wisely said, quote, "Tell me who you deal with, and I will tell you who you are," end quote. Geography here offers some tantalizingly suggestive possibilities in our attempts at understanding who the perpetrators were and how their relationships may have impacted the unfolding of the Holocaust in Janowska and in the larger region. Here we again can speak of proximity, but in this case, the proximity of perpetrators to each other as they moved throughout the Nazi system of persecution. Despite often substantial information about them, Holocaust scholars in general have not approached the perpetrators from a network perspective. Over the course of my research for the book, I was able to at least partially reconstruct the trajectories of 78 Camp SS and to connect them to over 400 identifiable locations over the course of their lives. From this, I could start to piece together the outlines of their social networks. I might note here that there are almost no surviving records from the camp itself. This means no transport lists of Jews or registry of prisoners. As a result, a network analysis of Janowska's victims remains out of reach. Even the perpetrator network is imperfect, as it had to be pieced together almost entirely from post-war judicial testimony. However, what I discovered by doing this research was that a lot of the Janowska SS men had connections that both preceded and followed their lives and their time in the camp. I'll show some of these connections now. One of the benefits of visualizing big data is that you identify patterns that you could not have seen by just going through the documents. Indeed, some of the patterns that emerge are often related to questions you hadn't even thought of asking before. In this way, a visualization can provide both answers to existing historical questions, as well as lead us to ask new questions. Let's start with a pattern of origin. A simple mapping of the birthplaces of Janowska men revealed that many of the SS men in the camp were so-called Volksdeutsche, that is, ethnic Germans, living in areas on the borders of or even outside of Germany. Two clusters of men appear prominently. The first is in former Silesia, which lay in a border region contested by Germany and Poland. 9 SS men had grown up within 70 kilometers of each other, and 6 others had been born in this region, including 2 commandants, Gebauer and Wartzak. A similar phenomenon emerged in the region of Eastern Europe known as the Banat, that stretches today over parts of Hungary, Romania, and Serbia. 5 Janowska perpetrators had grown up within 70 kilometers of each other here, including Peter Blum, who we have already met. What does this mean for our understanding of the camp? First, it quite evidently suggests that these men may well have known each other prior to arriving in Janowska. After all, they were members of an ethnic minority living in close proximity. Secondly, some scholars have suggested that Nazi perpetrators from border regions were more fervently nationalistic, as their nationality was contested in a way that it wasn't in other parts of the country. Remember, Wilhaus also comes from a border region, this one with France, right? Perhaps this, rather than the post-war excuse of conscription, explains how these men ended up in the Waffen-SS and then in Janowska. Visualizing the geographic networks of the Camp SS also uncovered prior relationships and shared experiences that I think are important in understanding Janowska. I'll take the example of SS man Adolf Kalanko here. Kalanko was born in Raciborz, a town in the region of Germany known as Upper Silesia, but one quite literally on the border with Poland and in modern-day Poland today. Before ever joining the SS, Kalanko had become acquainted with a future SS man, Roman Schönbach, when they both worked at the Siemens factory in Raciborz. Kalanko joined the SS in 1933 and attended an SS training course at the SD school in Bernau near Berlin, which also trained the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile shooting squads. One of the other SS men taking a course there was Josef Grzemek, who would go on to command the Lviv ghetto remnant known as the Gulag. After Berlin, Kalanko served as a member of the Nazi paramilitary Selbstschutz in Częstochowa, Poland. Here, he overlapped with 2 more future Janowska men. His next assignment was in Radom, where he guarded the SS and police leader there. This was none other than Friedrich Katzmann, who would be the SS and police leader for District Galician and preside over the Holocaust in Lviv. In early 1940, Kalanko helped establish a slave labor camp in Biała Podlaska, along with 4 future Janowska SS men. He then was assigned as a trainer of non-German guards in the Travniki camp. And this is the camp that supplied what are called Ukrainian guards, but also came from other non-Russian ethnicities to the extermination centers as well. He left that camp in January 1942, bound for Janowska with the reinforcements for the camp guard force, many of whom he had likely trained himself. Many other Janowska SS men followed similar trajectories, overlapping in other places and assignments before arriving in the camp. A surprising number of these men likely then had pre-existing relationships with each other. At its most basic level, this social network analysis shows us that few of the guards came into the camp as amateurs. Most already had some experience in Nazi anti-Jewish policy, and they brought this experience with them. Now, what might this tell us about familiarity, tell us about the camp itself? I've noted earlier that Janowska witnessed a shocking level of gratuitous violence, even for the Nazi camp system. In 1947, survivor Stanislava Gogolowska told a Lublin court that, quote, "I was in many camps, but I never experienced anywhere else the things that happened in the Janowska camp," end quote. Besides Janowska, she had been imprisoned in Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz. I would suggest that the guards' familiarity with each other served to heighten their own comfort with atrocity. One scholar has described among Nazi perpetrators a kind of bonding through transgression, what he described as, quote, "comradeship that lived off collective breaches of the norm," end quote. I would argue that a shared experience prior to arriving in the camp meant that these men felt no need to tone down or hide their violent tendencies, as one might in the presence of strangers, at least initially. This comfort with killing combined with examples set by the camp leadership to create a perfect storm of violence. And I just want to note here, because I've used a lot of images, and most of these images come from a man named Hermann Lewinter. Hermann Lewinter was a survivor. He was the official camp photographer, which is crazy. The SS allowed him to wander around the camp and take pictures, which he did, both sort of posed for the SS, but also of his own designs. And then he escaped and took the negatives with him, which is why we have these today. And I've used this image, I used it in all kinds of presentations in my research without noticing something. And if you look very carefully, in the upper right, you'll see a little girl. That's the commandant, it has to be, that's the commandant's daughter. And this is within the camp itself. So again, if we think about space and the fact they're living next to it, and the daughter she must be in there with either her father or her mother. I don't think she'd be there by herself. But it's always sort of haunted me to see that image in the background of a 4 or 5-year-old girl. What's more is that if we place Janowska in the center of this social network that I've been talking about, we see that these men flowed into but also out of the camp. Janowska cast a broad shadow over Galicia. One survivor of the camp, Michal Borwicz, wrote that, quote, "The camp on Janowska Street was a university of bestiality, while Majdanek and Dachau, Auschwitz and Buchenwald were merely secondary schools of the same bestiality," end quote. The camp climate created a whole cohort of SS men, educated a whole cohort of SS men in the proper way of handling prisoners. While some of the perpetrators may have been shaped prior to arriving in Janowska, others were formed within its walls. Take, for example, Friedrich Heinen. Heinen arrived in the camp in spring 1943 as a relatively young man of 22, and Borwicz, the survivor, noted that he was, quote, "tortured by a boyish ambition to pass for a mature man," end quote. Heinen's fellow SS men teased him relentlessly about his age and appearance. Survivor Borwicz wrote further that, quote, "Heinen wanted to stand out or be recognized for something, but in the camp it was not easy to distinguish oneself," end quote. The end result was that Heinen sought to demonstrate his manhood by ever more inventive ways of killing, eventually hanging women by their hair and swinging them back and forth to create a moving target. Many of the SS men from the camp will go on to work in or even command other camps in the region, sometimes returning from those sites as their prisons were liquidated. They took with them the norms of behavior that they had learned in Janowska. Moreover, their time together in the camp, and even before, created an informal network that helped to make the machinery of death run. For an example, let's return to Adolf Kalanko. In March 1943, he was placed in charge of his own small labor camp in the town of Grodek Jagiellonski, 30 kilometers west of Lviv. This camp was really a 2-story building surrounded by a chain-link fence and guarded by Ukrainians. Kalanko's Jewish prisoners worked on the DG4 highway mentioned earlier. Toward the end of June 1943, SS and police leader Katzmann decided to liquidate Kalanko's camp. An official in his office called Wilhaus to arrange the killing, and so a group of at least 7 Janowska SS participated in the liquidation of the Grodek Jagiellonski camp, shooting the prisoners one by one in an upstairs room and then attempting to burn the bodies. It also seems clear that this was not the first liquidation that these SS men from Janowska carried out. The informal network of perpetrators that developed in the Janowska camp, therefore, helped to facilitate mass killing throughout the region, as Katzmann and Wilhaus could draw on existing contacts to smoothly carry out murder with a minimum of coordination. Before I move on to some concluding thoughts, I should mention another important network that centered at Janowska. As early as 1942, the Nazis had begun considering ways to permanently destroy the bodies of their victims. In most places, they had simply been buried at first. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, tapped a former Einsatzgruppen commander, Paul Blobel, with this task. The operation was known by the code name Sonderkommando 1005. After a series of experiments to determine the best methods, and after destroying the bodies at the extermination centers, Blobel arrived next in Lviv. And this is the group that Leon Wells was forced to be a part of in his second time in the camp. In Lviv, Blobel set up a Sonderkommando 1005 detail to begin work at Janowska and another nearby killing site. But this group, led by the SS and manned by Janowska prisoners, did more than just dig up and burn Nazi victims. The Janowska Sonderkommando 1005 unit also became an academy for the SS, tasked with destroying bodies throughout the Nazi Empire. At least 10 iterations of SS men arrived for a 10-day training course with practical instruction on corpse disposal before fanning out across occupied Europe to employ their new skills in destroying the evidence of Nazi crimes. And so once again, Janowska found itself at the center of a network with far-reaching effects. As I close, and I am closing, I want to reflect on what place and space mean for us as people interested in understanding the Holocaust. I've already suggested how the meanings of place were important to the people at the time, both perpetrators and victims, as well as how connections of places, networks, played a very real role in the unfolding of the Holocaust, both in Janowska and in the region. But what about us? What does the topography of the Holocaust mean for us today? I would argue that consciously or not, we all experience history spatially. When we visit an historic site, we want to know where things are, where things were, and where are we in relation to what happened. Even the question of what was it like in the past is founded upon knowing what conditions were like in a certain place. Not surprisingly, for many, a visit to the site of a former concentration camp is a transformative one. Part of the reason for this is that visiting a Holocaust site is also a form of commemoration. We, the living, refuse to let the physical evidence of the Holocaust disappear. Thus, the built environment becomes a literal embodiment of memory. Nothing can replace the emotive experience of uncovering history in the space where it occurred. Of course, even this is, on some level, artificial. The Auschwitz of today provides only a sense of the Auschwitz of 1944. Gone are most of the barracks. Gone is the mud, replaced by acres of green grass. Gone are the sights, sounds, and smells that made it the hell that it was. Here we are reliant on signage to orient ourselves and on our imaginations to recreate the place. With Janowska, we are faced with an additional challenge. Just as the history of the camp has mostly disappeared from our memory, the physical spaces as well have almost completely disappeared. In 1944, the Soviets occupied the site, maintaining it as a prison. And a prison it remains today. And in fact, it's remained a prison ever since 1941. First by the Nazis, then by the Soviets, and now by the Ukrainians. Almost all the camp buildings within the footprint of the modern prison are also gone. Of the few remaining buildings outside of the camp, the former headquarters is the most important. It is today a multi-family home. If, as I have suggested, it is so important to understand the places of the Holocaust, how do we do that when they physically do not exist anymore? When we cannot walk the ground or darken the doorways? One solution to this dilemma that I'm exploring with the support of an AHRC grant is reconstructing the camp in a virtual world. What if we could take all the spatial evidence that we have from survivor testimony and memoirs to photographs and drawings, some of which you've seen here tonight, and use it to build a digital model of the camp? Might we then, in some sense, be able to walk the ground again and to again position ourselves within this landscape? Is it possible to have a site of commemoration that exists only in the digital world? There are, of course, lots of important conceptual and practical challenges that I won't get into here. But, to badly paraphrase Churchill, in a world in which both living memory and physical spaces of the Holocaust are rapidly disappearing, it seems critical to explore how the digital world, in all its power and might, can step forth to the rescue of the physical. I want to thank you again for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thanks again.
So we do have time for one or two questions. So questions from the audience, and we do have a roving mic going around, so if you do put your hand up, wait until the microphone appears beside you. So questions. There's one at the back there. Yeah.
Testing. Is this okay? Yeah, good.
It is.
Hi, Waitman. Ben Shepherd, Glasgow, Caledonia. Nice to see you again. Excellent talk. Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got two questions. First, a quick question. Is the Commandant's daughter still alive? I'd be interested to know that, and whether you were able to trace her or anything like that. Also, I'd like to know a bit more about the camp photographer, and how common or otherwise this practice was of letting an actual camp inmate walk around taking snaps of the camp. That's absolutely astonishing. So I'd be interested to know a bit more about that as well.
It's funny that you asked this. You'll see why in a minute. Many years ago, when I was researching this, I noted that, I did a little sleuthing in Germany. I noted that a person by the name of Heike Hansberg, which is Liesel Wilhaus, the wife's, she remarries. She's a despicable person, but she remarries after the war. The Wilhaus, by the way, if you want sort of a happy ending, he gets shot by the Soviets in Western Germany, in the back. So, anyway, she remarries. But I looked at the documents from the 1960s, and I ran the address, and there was a person living at her address by the name of her daughter. And I sent a letter, just sort of saying, I'm interested in this topic. No response. I just received an email, literally yesterday, that she's been located and may be willing to talk. So I'd be really interested to talk to her. I mean, obviously, she's an innocent person in all of this. She was 4 or 5 at the time. But it'd be very interesting to hear her thoughts, because she grew up with her mother, after the war. Her mother, Liesel Wilhaus, was charged with her crimes in the camp. And unfortunately, like as often happens, she got out of any kind of prosecution by claiming ill health, and then lived to like 1984. Regarding Herman Lewinter, yeah, it's really interesting. I don't have an answer. I sort of suggested earlier that Janowska is this kind of amateur hour-ish place. And Lewinter Herman does give some testimonies, and I'm in touch with his family. His family gave me all the copies of his photographs, which are amazing, and have been invaluable in this process of trying to reconstruct the site. But there's a lot of the history of him and of the photographs that's missing. The family told me that there were 100+ photographs that they originally donated to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., and the Holocaust Museum in D.C. has like 30. So I don't know where the rest of them are. It seems like he was allowed to walk around the camp and take pictures. And so the pictures that he takes are a mixture. So there are the formal posed pictures of the SS, who basically took advantage of him as a personal photographer. I mean, the picture at the front gate of Wilhaus is obviously Wilhaus looking like a king on his horse. And there's another version of that where it's much closer up. But then he does take some that are clearly surreptitious. He takes a picture of the camp orchestra, for example. One of the famous photographs of a circle of musicians that you may have seen in other sources. He takes that picture, most likely from that third floor building where Porath, the architect, worked. But I don't really know. And he managed to escape, and he brought the photographs with him. But in something that happens quite often, as you're familiar, I was listening to his testimony. He's obviously not around anymore. And, he's talking about the camp, and then he says, and then I escaped, and he goes on to something else. And you're like, wait a second, wait, hold up, like, come back. Can you tell us more about this whole escaping from this horrible place along with your photographs? But he didn't. So we're still trying to sort of unearth that. But it's a great question. I don't really have a great answer for it.
Okay, now, actually, unfortunately, we are really quite tight for time this evening, so I'm going to take one more, and the first hand that went up was that one there.
Thank you. Thank you for a very stimulating talk there. My question is, given the spatial proximity of the Janowska camp to what was a major city, what, if any, was the reaction of the Polish civilian population to what was going on in the camp? I cannot imagine that they did not know, given what was going on there.
Yeah, it's a really good observation. And I didn't talk about the connections between the camp and the city in this particular talk, but it's a good one. I think the first thing to recognize is that Lviv is a very complex place. It's, in the period before the war, it is a predominantly Polish city surrounded by a predominantly Ukrainian countryside, and a city in which the Poles are sort of the ruling class, the officials, the government officials, these kinds of things. And Jews are a very, very large minority in the city and are in a very difficult position because the Poles and the Ukrainians are always trying to get them to side with them, and when they don't, both sides are upset. And then this happened. This has impacts later on. So then, when the Soviets come in, the Poles are all of a sudden the dangerous minority, and so the Soviets victimize the Poles and elevate the Ukrainians in a certain sense. And the Nazis come in and also elevate the Ukrainians in a certain sense, and victimize whatever Poles are remaining. So there's an awful lot of persecution to go around in the city. The connections between the camp, first of all, I'll talk about for Jews. So what makes it an interesting place regarding its proximity is it's a double-edged sword. Because the camp is almost literally located in the city in which most of its prisoners are, they have connections outside of the camp that prisoners in other places don't have, because they have family members that are in the ghetto, for example, or living or in hiding or in little villages surrounding it. The ghetto itself sends doctors to other villages, Jewish doctors to other villages to try to fight typhus. It sends packages to the camp. When the prisoners are forced to go downtown for their bathhouse visit, oftentimes Jews and non-Jews that are trying to help them are able to sneak them food. And so this is a good thing. Conversely, because oftentimes prisoners have family members in the ghetto, they are prohibited from escaping, because what the Nazis will do is grab their families if they try to escape. And so one of the things that Leon does, after he gets away from the guy at the kitchens, he goes back to his workshop. He tells his fellow workers, he's like, look, if they report me missing at roll call, tell me, and I will come out and say I'm here, because I don't want them to go to the ghetto and get my family. And they don't, and so then he's able to escape. The local, and there are, by the way, some non-Jewish prisoners in Janowska. Janowska is also used as a punishment camp for Poles and Ukrainians that violate Nazi rules or hide Jews or these kinds of things. But predominantly, they're Jewish prisoners. There are lots of Ukrainians, local Ukrainians, who end up becoming guards there. Some of the Ukrainian policemen that are policemen in the town get assigned by the Germans to be guards there, which is a complex topic. But ultimately, it was something everybody knew about. At one point during the burning of the bodies, the Lviv fire department gets called out because they think there's a massive forest fire, and they show up and the Nazis say, "Go away, we've got this." It doesn't result in a great deal of sort of revolt in terms of the local population, though the Jews themselves have staged a remarkable and noteworthy escape that's up there with Sobibor and Treblinka and the ones that we're familiar with, but nobody else knows about. It's an amazing story that I haven't even talked about today. But it was an open secret. I think everyone knew about it. And the local population had their own problems to deal with. That's not an excuse for them, but I think that most of the Ukrainians and the Poles, were focused on themselves and not looking out for anybody else, which I think is unfortunately a very human reaction.
Okay, as I said, unfortunately, we have to whisk Waitman away to another venue. But I hope you'll join me in thanking Waitman for what was a truly insightful lecture this evening, and one that I certainly will remember for a very long time. So please join me in thanking Waitman. Let me finally thank you, our audience, both in the room here at the university and also those joining online for participating in the event this evening, but also being part of the process of remembering what happened during the Holocaust. So thank you all very much indeed, and safe home.